Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating. We're looking at a source that tackles an age-old topic, but it does it through a strictly investigative lens. It's a case study called Why I Trust Jesus Christ, a case built on evidence. Now, whether you grew up religious or you're a total skeptic, I really want you to lean in here. Because the author of our source material, they're doing something super compelling. They aren't treating belief in Jesus as some emotional reflex or, just caving to social pressure. Instead, they're approaching it as a strict historical question. We're going to look at verifiable evidence, ancient documents, and just pure logical deduction. Think of it like cracking open a historical cold case, and we're just going to follow the evidence exactly where it leads. The author actually kicks the whole argument off with this pretty striking reality. Over 2 billion people claim to follow him. Historians debate him, skeptics dismiss him, but almost no serious scholar denies he existed. It's kind of a massive paradox, right? So our source invites us to adopt a very specific starting point today. The author, who actually used to be a skeptic themselves, is asking us to just rationally examine the exact same historical data that ended up convincing them. We're literally stripping away centuries of tradition and just looking at the raw historical facts. So what does this all mean? Well, the crucial question this whole explainer hinges on is this. Can belief actually be based on verifiable evidence? The source material makes it totally clear. You are absolutely not being asked to blindly believe anything today. Instead, you're being asked to think, to look at the baseline facts logically and objectively. The most dangerous assumption we can make in any intellectual pursuit is just assuming a question isn't worth investigating. So, let's investigate. Okay, here's the docket for our investigation today. This is our roadmap. Number 1, the historical witnesses. Number 2, the manuscript evidence. Number 3, the central claim. And finally, number 4, liar, lunatic, or lord.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the historical witnesses.
So before we can even debate what someone did, the author points out that we have to answer a really foundational question. Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist as a real historical person? Because, well, if the answer is no, the rest of the case completely collapses. What's super interesting here is the author's focus on what historians call hostile witnesses. Think about it. If you want to prove someone existed, your best evidence doesn't come from their best friends, it comes from their enemies. Check out this timeline. Right around 93 AD, Josephus, he was a Jewish historian writing for the Romans, independently confirms Jesus and his followers. Then, around 116 AD, we have the Roman historian Tacitus. Now, Tacitus absolutely despised Christians. He literally called their beliefs a destructive superstition. But he still confirms that their founder was executed by Pontius Pilate. We also have records from Pliny the Younger and Suetonius. And here's the kicker. None of these guys had any motive to fabricate a story about Jesus. Doing so would only embarrass them or legitimize this movement they completely hated. When hostile witnesses independently confirm the baseline facts of someone's existence and execution, that is pretty much as strong as historical evidence gets. Moving on to Section 2, the manuscript evidence. Now, the skeptic's next logical pushback is totally fair. Even if he existed, how can we possibly trust ancient documents that have been copied by hand over millennia? Couldn't the stories have been totally altered? To answer this, the author compares the New Testament to other ancient texts that literally no one questions. Take Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. We base huge chunks of Roman history on it, but we only have about 250 manuscripts, and the earliest copy is from 900 years after Caesar actually wrote it. Homer's Iliad, 643 copies, with a 500-year gap. Plato, get this, just 7 copies, with a massive 1,200-year gap. Now, look at the New Testament. Over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, with the earliest fragments dating to within roughly 50 years of the original writings. So, by the standard metrics of historical study, meaning manuscript volume and the time gap, the author points out that the biblical texts aren't just reliable, they're in a completely different, unrivaled category of ancient preservation. It's not even close. But to be totally objective here, the author also points out a number that skeptics bring up a lot: 400,000. That is the rough number of scribal differences or variations found across all those thousands of ancient manuscripts. And yeah, at first glance, that number sounds absolutely devastating to the case, doesn't it? Well, here is how textual scholars actually reconcile that massive number. It turns out, the vast majority of these 400,000 differences are incredibly minor. We are talking about spelling variations, word order differences, like writing Jesus Christ instead of Christ Jesus, and just really obvious, easily recognizable copying mistakes. The absolute crucial takeaway from our source here is that not a single one of these 400,000 variations affects a core doctrine or the fundamental narrative, not one. Because we have so many manuscripts, it's like a giant puzzle. Historians can easily cross-reference them and reconstruct the original text with just extraordinary accuracy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the central claim.
All right, this is where history, evidence, and faith just collide directly. We're looking at the historical anomaly of the resurrection. So how do we actually analyze this? The author uses a framework called the minimal facts approach. Basically, these are 4 specific data points that the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars, and yes, that includes secular and non-Christian ones, accept as historically accurate. Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Number 2, his tomb was reported empty. Even his enemies didn't produce a body. They just claimed it got stolen. Number 3, his disciples genuinely believed they saw him alive afterward, like genuinely enough to be killed for that belief. And number 4, the sudden, totally inexplicable conversions of hostile enemies, like the persecutor Paul and Jesus' own skeptical brother James.
The source presents a pretty direct challenge to us here. If you're gonna dismiss the resurrection, you have to find an alternative theory that successfully accounts for all 4 of those minimal facts at the exact same time. So let's look at the alternatives. Was it a mass hallucination? Well, a hallucination is a psychological event in the mind, right? It definitely doesn't explain why a physical rock-cut tomb was empty. Okay, what if the disciples just stole the body? Sure, that explains the empty tomb, but it completely contradicts human nature. I mean, people will gladly die for a belief they think is true, but they rarely submit to torture and execution for a conspiracy they actively know they made up. The author argues that the resurrection hypothesis, well, it simply fits the historical puzzle better than any alternative anyone has proposed yet.
And that leads us to our final part. Section 4, liar, lunatic, or Lord. Even if all that historical data still leaves you pondering, the source asks us to look at his unprecedented teachings and the specific claims he made about his own identity. Just consider what this first-century figure was actually teaching in the middle of an occupied, honor and retaliation-driven Roman province. He claimed that greatness was found in service, not power. He preached this radical forgiveness for enemies. He elevated women, children, and the poor in a legal system that literally classified them as property. But he didn't stop at just being a moral philosopher. He also made these absolutely staggering claims about his divine identity, claims that no Jewish teacher had ever dared to make. And because of that, it makes it historically impossible to just neatly categorize him as a standard good teacher. And this brings us to a super famous framework by the former Oxford atheist C.S. Lewis, which is quoted directly in our source material. Lewis pointed out that a man who was merely human and said the astonishing things Jesus said about himself, he could not be regarded as simply a great moral teacher. He'd have to be either deeply delusional or deliberately deceptive. Lewis essentially argued that Jesus' immense claims intentionally eliminate that comfortable middle ground. You can't just politely admire the guy. You are forced to make a decision about his identity. So the author walks us through these 3 options, which is often called the trilemma. Option A, he was a liar. He knew his claims were totally false. But like we talked about, liars don't usually willingly endure crucifixion for a lie, and his profound teachings on morality really heavily conflict with the profile of some massive deceiver. Option B, he was a lunatic. He was genuinely delusional. But if you actually read his debates and teachings, they show an extraordinary level of strategic coherence, calmness, and clarity. That really doesn't fit a clinical delusion. So that leaves option C, Lord. His claims were true. According to the author, once you assemble all the historical, textual, and behavioral evidence, this option actually requires the fewest logical leaps.
As we wrap up this analysis, the author makes a very grounded concession right here. History rarely offers mathematical proof. You just can't prove ancient history in a test tube. What historical inquiry does offer is the best explanation for the available evidence. And the author's whole case is that when subjected to rigorous intellectual scrutiny, from hostile witnesses to manuscript validity, all the way to the minimal facts of the empty tomb, the evidentiary case for Jesus is remarkably strong.
Our source material ends with a final, deeply provocative challenge, quoting a question Jesus himself supposedly asked, "Who do you say I am?" Having walked through this structured analysis of the historical data, the text leaves the verdict entirely in your hands. You've seen the timeline. We've looked at the manuscripts, we've explored the logic of the trilemma, the evidence has been laid out on the table. Now it's really up to you to weigh it all and decide what you think is the best explanation.